Hey everybody, I just finished Through the Waters, a biblical theology of the book of Genesis by Caleb Lewis. This was published by Resource, which is an imprint of Whitfenstock, so it's basically published by Whitfenstock. And I'll take you through my typical format of commenting on who the author is and my connection with them, the main idea of the project, summarizing that, the research behind it, the readability of the style, and then just my general reactions at the end. So if that's all you're interested in, if that's what's most helpful for you, just jump forward to that, but I'll try to provide a little more depth on some of those other areas if that's also helpful. I want to say thank you to Resource for sending me this. They actually sent it to me because Caleb reached out to me. And so this is my about the author. Not too much to say there because I had no connection to him before. I was not familiar with him or his work before he actually reached out to me, but he is apparently a viewer of this channel. And based on other books I've looked at, he thought that I might be interested in what this book is about and kind of what he's doing with Genesis and the way he's reading and analyzing Genesis. And so after taking a kind of look a little bit more into more of this project, what's behind it, and what his kind of goals were, I agreed that I might have some interest in it and agreed to review it. And so that's how it came across my desk, so to speak. So thank you to Caleb for reaching out. Thanks also for following the channel, and thank you for putting me in touch with Whitfenstock to get this book. So, what is this book about? Well, it's pretty well captured by that subtitle, A Biblical Theology of the Book of Genesis, but there's some specific things that I think set this apart from other biblical theologies that might purport to be a biblical theology of Genesis specifically. So yes, this book, if you don't know what the term biblical theology is, it's kind of, it can be a little hard to wrestle that one to the ground sometimes, but my best kind of approach to explaining what biblical theology is using the narrative of Scripture and also the kind of entirety of Scripture to construct theological positions or arguments. So not starting outside of Scripture or starting with more like abstract metaphysical reflections, but starting with scriptural content and especially kind of the literary structure and the canonical, holistic canonical form of Scripture. So what he's doing is he's kind of doing that, but constrained to the book of Genesis itself. And more specifically, he is using two particular literary motifs, two particular literary structures that he argues really form kind of the overarching structure of Genesis. And these two microstructures, you could, I guess, say, are motifs, are the Exodus motif and then the two goats motif. Those are the two things he is analyzing, the lenses that he's using to analyze the story of Genesis. And so really briefly, the Exodus motif, and he goes into great detail in parsing out the components of each of these motifs, but the Exodus motif is a rescue motif. You know, obviously there's an entire book called Exodus that follows Genesis, and so the idea of either God's elect family or individual or group of people are oppressed and in some cases maybe imprisoned or stuck somewhere, and God hears their cry and pulls them out of that situation and rescues them and kind of blesses them into a new location or situation, which they promptly then fall back into some sort of imprisonment or exile or something like that. But that's the pattern, is them crying out from oppression and God hearing and reaching in and pulling them through waters in many cases, symbolically or literally, like through waters, hence the title of the book, and then setting them up in a new land or a new place or with a new blessing, and then they fall back in, and the pattern kind of cycles like that. That's the Exodus motif. The two goats motif, which I think is maybe it's just because the Exodus motif is more prominent in a lot of other books, and I've read a lot more about it. I think the two goats motif was more interesting to me. I'll say more about that in my reaction, but the two goats motif is played out frequently through two brothers, at least in the book of Genesis, and it's something like, an elder and a younger brother, and the younger brother being chosen or designated for blessing, and then rivalry existing between the two of them, sometimes violence happening, and the blessing of the younger brother being preserved, and then the older brother, typically as a result of whatever the conflict happened, the older brother being sent away into desert or wasteland or something, but with some sort of kind of blessing of God. And so that's a truncated version of the two goats motif, which is actually referring. If the Exodus motif refers most prominently to the book of Exodus, the two goats motif refers to the goats in Leviticus, the scapegoat being one of the two who was sent away, right? So that's a really interesting, I find that a more interesting motif maybe to analyze, just because I think it's a little bit more fresh or a little bit more unique. But anyways, what Caleb Lewis is doing is he's taking those two motifs and arguing that they are overwhelmingly prominent throughout the book of Genesis. They cycle through different characters, right? So looking at the table of contents here, the Exodus motif shows up in all kinds of characters like Sarah. It shows up in Rebecca from Abimelech. It shows up with Jacob. The two goats motif shows up in all kinds of rivalries. Cain and Abel is an obvious one to look at, but also Lot and Abram. It also shows up in Jacob and Esau, obviously. So what he does is he really steps you through. You get through kind of the entirety of the Genesis narrative story, and he shows you through the whole book of Genesis how these motifs cycle and keep showing up. So the reader of this book gets the story of Genesis, but through the lens of these two motifs, and he uses pretty in-depth word studies and exegetical Hebrew work to argue for these motifs that connect to each other, because they use a lot of the same verbiage and vocabulary. So anyways, that's a lot longer than I typically do on the main idea. There's kind of a lot of nitty-gritty pieces to what he's kind of arguing here. So that's what Through the Waters is about. It's chasing those two particular motif structures through the narrative of Genesis, the book of Genesis. Okay, I'll try to move more quickly through these next areas. The research of this project is interesting. It's good. He relies on commentary, like he relies somewhat on commentaries, but more so he relies on linguistic and exegetical and word studies. There's a lot of discussion of Hebrew words, and there's a lot of connections between vocabulary that shows up in different sections of the book of Genesis, like similar words, similar verbiage that shows up over the course of the structure of the book. And there's too many examples that to even start to go into, but he does a very kind of painstaking job to show the Hebrew words, show some of the cognates, show some of the roots, and then also point to other references and where it shows up. So there's a lot of language work being done in this book to make his case. He also does talk about other, like Seth Postel's book, Adam is Israel, is another very similarly kind of minded book, and he does interact with other biblical theologians, biblical theologies that are doing similar argumentation. Art of Biblical Narrative, Robert Alter is also, someone that comes to mind. So he does interact with other academic kind of sources, but I would say in general the heaviest kind of research is in the language side, especially in Hebrew word use. And it is pretty detailed. It gets fairly granular, which leads me to the readability piece. This is the part of the book probably that I don't know if struggled with is too strong a word for it, but it's a careful, to its credit, it's a careful argument, and it's an intentional argument, but it is quite detailed and quite granular, and pretty in the weeds when it comes to that linguistic stuff. And because of the nature of the argument, it can be repetitive from a readability standpoint, because he keeps going back to these same motifs and keeps saying, so here's where this piece of this motif shows up. Here's where this piece of that motif shows up. And then here's how this motif is maybe structured slightly differently from when it showed up in the last time. And so there's a lot of kind of cycling through that stuff. There's also a lot of charts. So I'll just show some examples here. A lot of charts showing the motif comparisons and the references in nearly every chapter. I'll show just maybe one or two more. Here's another one, just like kind of flipping through. So, and that kind of goes to show it feels a little bit like, it's the last example I'll show. They're very similar, but it's a lot of those. It feels a little bit like in a highly analytic engineering kind of lens on a narrative. Which I'm saying all this to say, if you are an analytic engineer type, and that's how you think, and you find that way of reasoning really helpful, you're probably going to absolutely adore this, because that's very much the mode. He's very careful and very painstaking and very clear. If you like your biblical theology is more artful and flowery and expressive and creative, this one's gonna not be as easy for you to get through. I leaned a little bit more personal taste in that direction, so I found myself finding some of the repetition a little hard at points. But I also commend the argument for its care and its thoroughgoing nature. So I just kind of wanted to spend a minute on that to let you know, as a potential reader, let you know where that stuff all sits, so that you can hopefully decide what this is going to be like for you as a reader. And then finally, that gives me to my reactions. So I have a little bit of mixed bag of reactions to this one that I'll just talk through as I end this review. So first of all, I really like the approach. And that's, I think, the reason why Caleb reached out to me. And he was right. Like, I love thoughtful biblical theologies that take the literary structures of the text seriously and presume, or at least give the benefit of the doubt to the writers that they were intelligent writers and intentional with the ways that they structured their stories and used their language. And that over time, especially the way that these stories have been preserved for eons now, to lend some credit to the fact that the structures may be intentional, and maybe they rhyme, so to speak, maybe they echo each other, so to speak, because they're making points. Like, I love writers who kind of enter the text with that sort of respectful posture, and he very much does that here. And so I'm really on board with the approach. I also really, to continue positive thoughts, I really liked his identification of the two motifs. There were moments where I was like, oh my gosh, I see this Exodus motif here. Even in the opening pages on his account of creation, and creation being an exodus through the waters, right, into kind of restoration, or into kind of new blessing, that landed with me. And there were moments where I thought, oh yeah, I'm seeing this oppression and rescue pattern, even in Genesis, kind of foreshadowing the grand Exodus. Like, it really affected some of my view of some of that stuff. And another positive thing that I'll say that I alluded to at the beginning, I really liked the two goats motif a lot. I thought that was my favorite aspect of this book. I liked how he brought that out. It really, it's not hard to notice the two brother pattern in Genesis. Like, any non-biblical scholar student can read that. If you sit down and read Genesis, you notice, like, hey, there's some patterns here that seem to be like very obviously intentional. But him linking those to the two goats motif is really helpful, and that was probably connecting those dots for me was one of my favorite kind of takeaways from this book. So if all those positives sound really good to you, then I think you probably really appreciate this book. The reason it's mixed for me is because of that readability thing that I already talked about, so I'm not going to belabor that point. I did find the repetitiveness a little difficult. I found the drier analytical style not as exciting to get through, and that's mostly a taste thing. I will also say that at points, and I'm not enough of a scholar to really adjudicate this particularly, but it did leave me with a question of, like, at what point are word studies, doing a word study and saying, hey, this word shows up this many times and it shows up here and here and here, like, I felt like I didn't have quite enough semantic linguistic expertise to make a judgment as to say that, yes, that's good evidence for a repeated motif, or maybe you need to show more evidence than just repeated word use for a motif. I had a little bit of that question lingering in my mind as I read it. But on the other hand, so that was sometimes a wrinkle. On the other hand, there were times where, like, he made it very clear, like, hey, these words are rare, and the fact that they show up intentionally here, here, and here, and here makes a pretty clear through line, especially when you see these other motifs that are on top of these words. And so that's a little bit of a tension, I suppose, in the argument. At times it really works well for the case he's trying to make, and other times it made me wonder, like, are there dots being connected here that really actually can't be connected? But I can't really settle that because I'm not a Hebrew scholar. But I guess you could say at the end of the day, he's raising those questions that actually helps a reader like me reapproach the book of Genesis with a more kind of curious, interested lens. So that's a win. So there you go. Okay, I'm gonna land this plane here. This went longer than I intended to. It's not a very long book. But it has a lot. It has a lot in it that you can kind of peel apart and ask and interrogate and start to follow up on. And it really does give you a big gulp of what Genesis is doing. And so if you love the book of Genesis and you haven't looked at it through these particular lenses he's proposing, I bet you'd probably find something really interesting and refreshing here. But I hope that my talking through pros and cons, kind of my reactions to all this, has been helpful as you think about whether this would be something that might enrich your own reading life, or might be something you want to spend some time with. But as always, those are my thoughts on this book, Through the Waters. Thank you, Caleb, again, for reaching out to me. Thanks for following the channel. And as always, thank you for taking a few minutes to watch.